lonely cowboy forced to marry a schoolteacher, but she understood his mute child's silence. The ranch was quiet, except for the occasional lowing of the cattle or the soft clatter of a horse's hooves in the distance. This quiet, once comforting, now felt heavy. Samuel had lived alone for many years, and while he loved the land, there was a loneliness in the wide-open spaces that sometimes pressed on his chest like a weight he could not lift. Samuel's life had never been easy. He had inherited the ranch from his father, a stern man who had taught him everything about cattle, horses, and the land, but little about family and love. Samuel had married once long ago, hoping to build a family, but life had been cruel. His wife had left, unable to handle the isolation and the hard work, and Samuel had been left with only his young son, Eli. Eli was a quiet boy, not speaking a single word since birth. Doctors had called it selective mutism, though Samuel never understood it fully. The boy's silence worried him every day, though he never blamed Eli. To Samuel, his son was a miracle, a piece of him he had to protect at all costs. Eli followed his father everywhere, often walking silently behind him, or watching him from a distance while Samuel worked with the cattle. The boy had a way of observing that made Samuel feel as if Eli could see straight into his heart. Sometimes, when Samuel was alone and tired, he would catch Eli's eyes and wonder what the boy was thinking. Was he happy? Lonely? Did he understand the world as well as his father hoped? Samuel had no answers, only a silent hope that his son would one day speak. Life on the ranch was hard. Samuel woke before dawn every day, feeding the animals, checking the fences, and tending to the land. The work was endless and often the days blurred together, yet he never complained. Samuel found comfort in routine, in the rhythm of the land, and in the quiet companionship of his son. Eli, though silent, was attentive and helpful. He could carry water, gather firewood, and even help guide the horses with surprising skill for his age. Samuel sometimes smiled at the boy's quiet competence, feeling proud and anxious all at once. Despite their bond, Samuel often felt a gnawing emptiness in his life. He longed for someone to share the weight of the ranch and the quiet moments of their lives. But Samuel was stubborn and set in his ways. He had little faith that anyone could truly understand him or his son, and the thought of opening his heart to someone new scared him. He had seen too many people leave, too many hearts broken, and he feared that inviting someone into his life would only bring more pain. One afternoon, as the heat shimmered over the plains and the cattle rested in the shade, a neighbor came riding up on horseback. John, an older man who had known Samuel all his life, carried news that made Samuel tense. "Sam," John said cautiously, "you might need to think about finding someone to help you and Eli. A schoolteacher, maybe. Someone who can be a wife to you and care for the boy." Samuel stiffened. He had heard the whispers in town, but hearing John say it aloud made his chest tighten. "I don't need anyone," Samuel muttered, looking away. "I can manage." "I know you can manage, son," John said gently. "But a woman could help Eli, teach him, give him someone to trust. You've done your best, Sam, but you can't do everything alone, and you shouldn't have to." Samuel's jaw tightened and he nodded slowly. He knew John was right, even if he hated to admit it. The thought of leaving his son's care to a stranger terrified him. What if she didn't understand Eli? What if she couldn't handle his silence? What if she changed everything? That night, Samuel sat by the fire, Eli on his lap, staring at the flickering flames. The boy rested his head on Samuel's shoulder, silent but trusting. Samuel ran his hand over Eli's hair, feeling the soft strands slip through his fingers, and wondered how anyone could enter their lives without disturbing the delicate balance they had. But deep down, he also knew that Eli needed more than he could give alone. The boy needed someone who could guide him, nurture him, and perhaps see the boy's spirit more clearly than Samuel ever could. Days passed, and Samuel began to think seriously about the idea of a schoolteacher. He imagined a kind woman who could teach Eli not just letters and numbers, but patience and understanding. He pictured someone with a gentle voice, someone who could fill the empty corners of the house with laughter and warmth. Yet every thought brought a pang of fear. How could he trust anyone with his son? How could he trust anyone with his heart? Still, Samuel knew change was inevitable. The town's whispers grew louder. Neighbors would casually ask if he had found someone yet, and though Samuel tried to brush it off, he could feel their eyes on him, their unspoken judgment pressing in. He realized that staying isolated would not protect him or Eli. It would only prolong the loneliness and the uncertainty that clung to them like the dry dust of the plains. One morning, Samuel decided he could wait no longer. He rode into town, Eli riding quietly beside him, his small hands gripping the reins with care. Samuel approached the schoolhouse, a modest building with peeling paint and a bell that rang sharply across the square. Inside he found Clara, a young schoolteacher with bright eyes and a calm demeanor. She looked up from her desk, surprised to see a cowboy and a small boy standing at the door. "Can I help you?" she asked gently, her voice kind but firm. Samuel swallowed, trying to find words he rarely used with strangers. I'm Samuel. This is my son, Eli. I hear you teach children." Clara studied Eli with quiet interest, noting the boy's stillness, the way his eyes followed Samuel's every movement, and the subtle gestures he made with his hands. "Yes," she said softly. "I teach children. I would be happy to help in any way I can." Samuel's chest tightened again, but he nodded. He had taken the first step, though the path ahead was unknown and frightening. He knew that bringing Clara into their lives would not be simple. There would be misunderstandings, challenges, and perhaps even resistance from Eli. But for the first time in a long time, Samuel felt a small flicker of hope. Perhaps with Clara life could be a little brighter, a little fuller, and maybe, just maybe, Eli's silence would not feel so heavy anymore. As they rode back to the ranch, Samuel glanced at Eli. The boy looked at Clara with curious eyes, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Samuel felt something he had not felt in years, a fragile sense of possibility. The sun was setting over the plains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was the end of one chapter and the quiet beginning of another. That night, as Samuel and Eli sat under the stars, he thought about the life ahead. He did not know what challenges awaited them, but he knew that for Eli, for himself, and for the small flicker of hope in his heart, he would try. He would open his life to someone new, even if it scared him. Because sometimes, even the loneliest cowboy needs help to find the warmth and understanding that only another human heart can offer. And somewhere in the stillness, Samuel believed that Eli's silence was not emptiness, but a secret language, waiting for someone patient enough to understand. Perhaps Clara could be that person. The morning Clara arrived at Samuel's ranch, the sun was just beginning to climb over the hills, casting long shadows across the dusty land. Samuel waited on the porch, adjusting his worn hat as he watched the distant road. His heart was heavy with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. He had never welcomed anyone into his home before, and the thought of a stranger, even one who came to teach and care for Eli, filled him with both hope and fear. Clara's carriage bounced along the rough path leading to the ranch. She was carrying a small trunk filled with her belongings, neatly packed and tied with care. When she finally stepped down and looked around, her eyes widened slightly at the vastness of the land. She had taught in towns before, but nothing had prepared her for the quiet, wide-open ranch that stretched endlessly under the sky. Samuel nodded to her, his face serious but polite, and offered a hand. "I'm Samuel," he said simply. "This is my son, Eli." Eli stood behind his father, clutching the reins of a small pony, his wide eyes observing Clara closely. He did not speak, not because he was shy, but because he simply had never found the words. Clara knelt slightly to his level and smiled warmly, her voice soft and gentle. "Hello, Eli, I'm Clara. It's nice to meet you." She didn't demand a reply, and the boy blinked slowly, studying her face. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Eli's fingers twitched as if he were reaching out to understand her. Samuel watched silently, a knot of worry forming in his stomach. Clara spent her first day familiarizing herself with the ranch. She followed Samuel as he checked the fences and fed the animals, asking questions politely but not intrusively. Samuel was cautious at first, answering in short sentences, unsure if she could handle the life of a ranch. He had expected a delicate, city-bred woman who might be overwhelmed by the dirt, the animals, and the constant work. But Clara surprised him. She asked questions that showed curiosity, not fear. She helped Eli gather firewood without complaint and even carried buckets of water when the sun grew hot overhead. As the day went on, Clara began to notice Eli's quiet ways. He watched everything, from the way Samuel moved through the barn to how the cows reacted to a sudden noise. She realized that his silence was not emptiness but careful observation. He had his own rhythm, his own way of communicating without words. Clara knelt beside him and drew shapes in the dirt with a stick, mimicking the way he sometimes traced letters with his fingers. Eli watched, fascinated, and for the first time, a small smile appeared on his lips. It was fleeting, almost shy, but it filled Clara with a quiet hope. Samuel, standing a little distance away, felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. He wanted to trust Clara, but his instincts told him to protect Eli at all costs. What if she did not understand his son? What if she tried to force him to speak, or worse, dismissed his silence as a problem? Samuel's chest tightened as he watched Clara and Eli, her patience evident in every gentle gesture. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, she could be the person to help them both. By evening, Clara had settled into a small room in the house. She unpacked her few belongings carefully, placing her books neatly on a shelf and hanging her dresses in the wardrobe. Samuel worked quietly in the kitchen, preparing a simple meal of beans and bread. Eli sat at the table, watching, occasionally glancing at Clara with curiosity. There was a gentle tension in the air, a mix of new beginnings and uncertainty. Over dinner, Samuel spoke in his usual short sentences. "Clara, this is our home. Things are simple here. You will help with Eli. You will teach him, yes." Clara nodded, her eyes calm and steady. "Yes, Samuel, I will help him, and I will try to understand him even if he doesn't speak. That is what teaching is about, not forcing, but guiding." Eli watched her silently, his small hands fidgeting with the edge of his plate. There was a faint spark of recognition in his eyes, as if he understood her words more than he could express. Samuel, noticing the look, felt a warmth he had not felt in years. Perhaps Eli sensed something too, that this woman was different. She would not judge him or force him to be someone he was not. The days that followed were filled with small, careful steps. Clara helped Eli learn his letters, numbers, and basic words, but she never pressured him to speak aloud. Instead, she encouraged him to express himself in other ways, drawing pictures, pointing at objects, or even writing single words in the dirt. Eli responded slowly, but he responded. Each small smile, each tiny nod was a victory. Samuel observed quietly, pride and relief mingling in his chest. At the same time, Clara and Samuel began to understand each other. Samuel, who had always been reserved, found himself speaking more openly with Clara. He shared stories of his childhood, of his late wife, and of the challenges of raising Eli alone. Clara listened patiently, never interrupting, always responding with empathy. In return, she shared her own life, her love for teaching, her longing to make a difference in a child's life, and her hope that the quiet boy might one day speak. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Clara took Eli outside to watch the horses. She knelt beside him and mimicked the gestures he often used to communicate. Slowly, Eli began to copy her, making small hand signs that clearly conveyed his thoughts. Samuel watched from the porch, a sense of awe washing over him. His son, who had never spoken a word, was beginning to express himself in a way that was real and meaningful, and it was Clara who had unlocked this small, precious connection. Evening conversations became moments of quiet bonding. Samuel would speak in his low, steady voice. Clara would respond softly, and Eli would sometimes interject with a small gesture, a smile, or a written word. The ranch, once filled only with the sounds of animals and the wind, began to carry the soft echoes of human connection. Samuel realized that life did not need to be loud to be full. Silence, when understood and respected, could also carry love and trust, but not everything was easy. Clara sometimes faced challenges with Eli, who could be stubborn or fearful. He would sometimes retreat into silence, hiding behind his father, refusing to engage. Clara never forced him, understanding that trust had to be earned slowly. Samuel, who had seen his son struggle for years, marveled at her patience. He began to realize that patience, kindness, and understanding were far more powerful than words. Neighbors, curious about the new arrangement, began to notice the changes on the ranch. Some whispered, wondering if a schoolteacher could truly live on a ranch, caring for a cowboy and a mute child. Samuel ignored the gossip, focusing instead on the subtle transformations he could see every day. Eli smiling more often, following Clara's instructions without fear, and even attempting small gestures to communicate with Samuel himself. The household, once quiet and solitary, was slowly becoming a home. One afternoon, while repairing a fence with Samuel, Eli stopped and drew a small picture in the dirt, a simple house with 3 figures inside. Samuel's heart clenched as he recognized the meaning. He looked at Clara, who knelt beside the boy, her eyes shining with understanding. The boy was trying to tell them that he felt safe, that he felt like part of a family. Samuel felt a lump in his throat, realizing that perhaps this quiet schoolteacher, this woman from a distant town, was exactly what they both needed. The first weeks passed with small victories, laughter, and moments of quiet reflection. Samuel, who had feared change and the intrusion of a stranger into their lives, began to feel a fragile sense of hope. He saw the bond forming between Clara and Eli, a bond built not on words but on understanding, patience, and gentle care. He began to imagine a life where the silence of his son was no longer a barrier but a bridge to connection. By the end of the month, Samuel admitted to himself something he had not felt in years: gratitude. He was grateful for Clara's presence, for her willingness to enter their world without judgment, and for her ability to see the beauty in Eli's silence. He realized that the quiet moments, the shared work, and the soft gestures of care were creating a family in a way he had never thought possible. And as the sun set behind the hills, casting long shadows over the ranch, Samuel, Clara, and Eli sat together outside. Eli drew in the dirt while Clara smiled and Samuel watched silently, his heart full. The ranch was still dusty, the work still hard, but the loneliness that had once pressed on Samuel's chest had begun to lift. For the first time, he felt a sense of belonging, not just for himself, but for Eli, and for the quiet, understanding schoolteacher who had entered their lives and quietly changed everything. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between Clara, Samuel, and Eli grew slowly but surely. Life on the ranch continued to be demanding, with chores that began at dawn and often stretched long into the evening. Yet, for the first time in years, Samuel felt a sense of calm. He noticed little changes that warmed his heart: Eli laughing quietly while helping Clara with chores, or watching the boy's small hand reach for hers when he wanted to show her something. These small gestures mattered more than words ever could. Clara spent her days observing Eli closely. She noticed the way he tilted his head when he was curious, the way his fingers twitched when he was thinking, and the small expressions that passed over his face when he was happy or upset. She realized that Eli had his own language, a language of gestures, drawings, and expressions. If she could learn to understand it, she could communicate with him in a way that was natural and comforting. One morning, Clara set up a small table outside under the shade of an old oak tree. She placed paper, pencils, and small paints on the table. "Eli," she said softly, "let's try something. You can tell me anything you want here. Draw it, write it, show it. I'll watch and listen." Eli's eyes lit up, though he said nothing. He carefully picked up a pencil and began to draw shapes and figures on the paper. Clara knelt beside him, watching intently. She asked gentle questions, pointing to his drawings. "Is this the ranch? Are these the horses?" Eli nodded slightly, a small smile appearing on his face. For the first time, Samuel noticed that his son seemed to relax in Clara's presence, trusting her completely. The process was slow. Some days, Eli refused to participate, retreating into silence and hiding behind his father. Samuel, who had grown protective over the years, would often step in, placing a hand on Eli's shoulder and whispering reassurances. But Clara never forced him. She knew that trust could not be rushed. She waited patiently, giving Eli space when he needed it and encouragement when he was ready. Samuel began to see the effects of Clara's patience. Eli became more confident in his actions, more willing to explore and experiment. He would point to objects, draw pictures to explain his thoughts, and sometimes even write single words in the dirt. Samuel realized that communication did not have to be spoken aloud to be meaningful. Eli's silence was not a limitation, but a different way of experiencing the world, a world that Clara was helping him navigate with understanding and care. As the weeks passed, Samuel and Clara also grew closer. They worked together to manage the ranch, sharing chores and responsibilities. Clara learned to ride horses, mend fences, and even milk cows, skills she had never imagined she would master. Samuel, in turn, found himself opening up about his fears, his past, and his hopes for Eli. He spoke quietly without drama, but the honesty in his voice touched Clara deeply. She understood that this man, who appeared rugged and unyielding, carried a deep well of love and protection for his son. One afternoon, a storm rolled in over the plains. Dark clouds gathered quickly and the wind picked up, bending the tall grass. Clara and Eli were tending the smaller animals when the first drops of rain began to fall. Eli hesitated, looking frightened, and Clara quickly took his hand. "It's okay, Eli. We'll be safe," she said softly. Together they ran toward the barn, Samuel following closely behind. Inside the barn, they huddled near the animals, listening to the thunder rumble above. Eli leaned against Clara, his small body trembling slightly. Clara stroked his hair gently, speaking softly to him. "I'm here, Eli. You're safe with me." Samuel watched from a distance, feeling a wave of gratitude and relief. The storm was outside, but inside, a bond of trust and protection had grown even stronger. After the storm passed, Eli picked up a piece of chalk and wrote a single word on the barn wall. "Safe." Samuel's eyes filled with tears. That one word, written carefully and proudly, was more powerful than anything spoken aloud. It was a declaration of trust, of understanding, and of the connection that had grown between Clara and his son. Samuel felt a quiet pride, knowing that Clara had helped unlock a part of Eli that he had never seen before. The community around the ranch began to notice the changes too. Neighbors who had once whispered about the unlikely arrangement now spoke in admiration of Clara's patience and dedication. They saw Eli smiling more often, interacting with both his father and Clara, and slowly opening up to the world. Samuel, who had once felt isolated and judged, began to accept that having someone to share the burdens of life was not a weakness but a strength. Clara introduced new routines to help Eli grow. She would read to him each morning, using expressive gestures and pictures to make the stories come alive. She encouraged him to keep a small journal, drawing and writing about his day. Eli began to respond, using pictures and symbols to communicate his thoughts, dreams, and feelings. Samuel, though still quiet, began to understand more and more of Eli's world. He marveled at how Clara had bridged the gap between father and son, teaching them both that love and patience could speak louder than words. One evening, Samuel returned from the fields to find Clara and Eli sitting on the porch. Eli was holding a small wooden bird he had carved, carefully shaping it with his tiny hands. Clara smiled at Samuel and gestured for him to sit. Eli handed the bird to his father. Samuel looked at it, feeling a lump in his throat. The bird was simple, but it was filled with care, effort, and meaning. He understood that this small gift was Eli's way of expressing gratitude and affection. Samuel's heart swelled with emotion. He realized that Clara's presence had done more than help Eli communicate. She had transformed their family. Their lives were no longer solitary or burdened with silent struggles. Instead, each day brought small victories, moments of joy, and a deeper understanding of each other. Samuel began to see that love was not about grand gestures or loud declarations. It was about presence, patience, and understanding, even when no words were spoken. Clara also learned from Samuel. She gained a deeper appreciation for the land, for hard work, and for the quiet moments that often go unnoticed. She learned to ride a horse across the plains, mend fences in the scorching sun, and care for animals with gentleness and skill. But most importantly, she learned the unspoken language of Eli, a language that required patience, attention, and an open heart. One afternoon, as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Clara and Eli were drawing in the dirt near the barn. Samuel stood a short distance away, leaning against the fence, watching the boys' small hands move with concentration. Clara looked at Samuel and smiled. "He's teaching me as much as I'm teaching him," she said softly. Samuel nodded, understanding the truth in her words. Eli's silence was not a void. It was a gift, a window into a mind that thought deeply and felt intensely. By the end of part 3, the family had grown closer than Samuel could have imagined. The bond between father, son, and teacher was no longer fragile but strong and steady. Each small gesture, each quiet moment, had built a foundation of trust and love. Samuel began to feel something he had not felt in years: hope. Hope that Eli's silence could be understood, that their family could thrive, and that life on the ranch could be filled with joy and connection. And as the stars began to shine over the quiet plains, Samuel, Clara, and Eli sat together on the porch. Eli drew a small picture of the three of them holding hands, a simple representation of the family they were becoming. Samuel's chest filled with warmth, and Clara's eyes glistened with quiet pride. In the silence of the night, no words were needed. Their hearts spoke for them, and the bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. As the seasons changed, life on the ranch began to settle into a rhythm that felt natural to Samuel, Clara, and Eli. Spring brought a fresh sense of life, with green shoots appearing on the once barren land, flowers blooming near the farmhouse, and the soft sound of water trickling in the nearby creek. The air seemed lighter, filled with possibility, and Samuel felt that something inside him had shifted. The loneliness that had pressed on his heart for so long was slowly lifting, replaced by a quiet, steady warmth that came from having Clara and Eli beside him. Clara had become more than a teacher to Eli. She was his guide, his protector, and the person who could understand the depths of his silence. She had created small routines that helped Eli feel secure, like morning walks across the fields, drawing lessons under the shade of the old oak tree, and storytelling sessions in the evenings by the fireplace. Samuel watched quietly as Eli responded to her patience and kindness, slowly revealing more of himself through gestures, drawings, and small written words. Samuel, too, was learning to trust Clara. At first, he had been wary of letting someone into their lives, fearing that Eli's silence would make it impossible for her to connect with him. But Clara had shown a rare understanding, never forcing the boy to speak, never judging him, and always approaching him with patience. Samuel began to see that her presence did not replace him as a father, but complemented his efforts. Together, they were building a home where Eli could thrive, and Samuel found comfort in sharing both responsibilities and joys with Clara. The work on the ranch continued to be demanding. There were fences to repair, cattle to care for, and the land itself to tend. But Clara proved herself capable, learning the rhythms of ranch life quickly. She rode horses, carried heavy buckets of water, and even helped mend fences alongside Samuel. Eli, meanwhile, eagerly assisted them both, using his small hands to hold tools, carry wood, and help with the animals. The boy's confidence grew with each task, and Samuel marveled at how far he had come. The silence that had once seemed so heavy now felt like a quiet bond, a way of communicating without words but with deep understanding. One day, a small crisis tested the family's growing unity. A sudden storm swept across the plains, dark clouds rolling in with alarming speed. The wind howled, bending the trees, and lightning lit up the sky in jagged streaks. Samuel rushed to secure the animals, while Clara gathered Eli and guided him to the safety of the barn. The boy clung to her hand, his small body trembling, but he trusted her completely. Samuel, watching them from a distance, felt a surge of gratitude. Clara had earned Eli's trust in a way that he had never been able to, and he realized that her presence was a gift beyond measure. After the storm passed, the family assessed the damage together. A few fences had fallen, and some of the cattle had wandered off, but nothing was lost beyond repair. Samuel and Clara worked side by side, with Eli helping wherever he could. The experience brought them closer, reinforcing the unspoken trust and cooperation that had developed between them. Samuel felt a deep sense of pride in both his son and Clara, recognizing that they were no longer merely surviving, they were thriving as a family. Clara also introduced new learning opportunities for Eli. She taught him to read simple stories, using gestures and pictures to help him understand the meaning of the words. She encouraged him to write down his thoughts in a small journal, drawing pictures and symbols when words failed him. Samuel watched with amazement as Eli slowly began to express himself in ways he never had before. Each small achievement, whether a written word or a carefully drawn picture, was celebrated quietly but joyfully by all three of them. Evenings became a time of connection. Samuel would sit on the porch, Clara beside him, and Eli playing quietly nearby, drawing or mimicking gestures he had learned. Sometimes they would share stories of the day, not always in words, but through gestures, drawings, and laughter. Samuel had once thought that silence would always separate him from his son, but now he realized that understanding could bridge even the deepest gaps. Clara had taught them that love and patience were more powerful than speech alone. The bond between Samuel and Clara also deepened during these months. They began to understand each other's strengths and weaknesses, learning how to complement one another. Samuel admired Clara's patience, kindness, and intelligence, while Clara respected Samuel's strength, integrity, and deep love for his son. Their relationship grew quietly, built on shared experiences, mutual respect, and the understanding that family was not only about blood but about care, effort, and presence. One particularly warm afternoon, Samuel and Clara were working together to repair a section of fence. Eli watched from nearby, carefully drawing in the dirt with a stick. Samuel glanced at Clara, noticing how naturally she moved among the animals and how gently she guided Eli when he needed help. A small smile crept across his face. "You've done well," he said softly, almost as if afraid to speak too loudly. Clara looked up, meeting his gaze. "We've done well," she corrected gently. Samuel felt a flicker of warmth at her words, realizing that she considered him an equal partner, not just a caretaker of the land. As weeks turned into months, Eli's progress became more evident. He began to show more initiative, helping with the animals and even attempting to speak short words when he felt safe. The moments were brief and cautious, but each one filled Samuel and Clara with quiet pride. They celebrated these small victories privately, knowing that each step forward was hard-won and meaningful. Eli, in turn, seemed happier, more confident, and more willing to engage with the world around him. The ranch itself seemed to reflect the changes in the family. The land, once dry and dusty, was now vibrant with life. Animals thrived under their care, crops grew steadily, and the house felt warm and welcoming. Samuel noticed that the silence that had once weighed heavily on him was now a comforting presence. He no longer feared Eli's muteness, but saw it as part of the boy's unique way of experiencing the world. With Clara by their side, they had created a home where love and understanding filled the spaces between words. Neighbors began to notice the change as well. They saw a cowboy who had once been quiet and solitary laughing with his son, and the schoolteacher. They admired Clara's dedication and patience, recognizing that she had not only taught Eli but had helped bring the family together. Samuel, who had once resisted the idea of accepting help or attention, began to feel a sense of belonging in the community. He realized that opening his life to others did not weaken him, it strengthened the bonds that mattered most. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Samuel, Clara, and Eli sat together on the porch. Eli was drawing in the dirt, Clara watching with a gentle smile, and Samuel leaning back in his chair, feeling content. Eli had drawn 3 figures holding hands, simple yet powerful in its meaning. Samuel's chest filled with warmth. He understood that this was not just a drawing but a statement of love, trust, and family. Clara looked at Samuel and said softly, "He's happy here. He feels safe, loved, and understood. That is because of both of us." Samuel nodded, realizing the truth in her words. He had feared that life on the ranch would always be lonely, that Eli's silence would create distance. But now he saw that love, patience, and understanding could build bridges where words were absent. In the weeks that followed, the family continued to grow closer. They faced small challenges together, from unexpected weather to difficult chores, but each challenge only strengthened their bond. Samuel found himself speaking more openly with Clara, sharing his hopes, fears, and dreams. Clara, in turn, shared her own thoughts and feelings, creating a partnership built on trust and mutual respect. Eli, though still quiet, responded with gestures, drawings, and occasional short words, expressing his thoughts in ways that were meaningful and heartfelt. By the end of Part 4, the family had transformed. What had begun as a hesitant and uncertain arrangement had become a true family unit. Samuel, once a lonely cowboy, had found companionship and partnership. Clara, once a schoolteacher entering an unfamiliar world, had found purpose, love, and belonging. And Eli, the silent boy, had found understanding, patience, and the freedom to express himself in his own unique way. Life on the ranch was still hard, but it was filled with love, laughter, and connection. The quiet that had once weighed heavily on Samuel and Eli was now a space of understanding and comfort. Together, they had built a home where each member was valued, respected, and cherished. And in the golden light of the plains, Samuel felt something he had not felt in years: hope for the future, trust in the present, and gratitude for the family he had found in the most unexpected way. Time passed quietly on the ranch, yet each day felt fuller than the last. Samuel, Clara, and Eli had built a life together, a rhythm that balanced work, learning, and quiet moments of connection. Samuel often reflected on how much had changed since Clara had arrived. The ranch, which had once been silent and lonely, was now alive with small sounds of laughter, movement, and trust. Even Eli, who rarely spoke, had begun to communicate in ways that were meaningful and expressive, bridging the gap between his silence and the love around him. One morning, as the sun spilled gold across the fields, Clara and Eli were walking along the creek that ran near the edge of the ranch. Eli carried a small notebook he had been using to record his drawings and short words. Clara watched him with gentle pride, noticing how carefully he traced the shapes of letters and symbols. "You're doing so well, Eli," she said softly. The boy paused, looked up at her, and for the first time whispered a single word, "Clara." Clara's heart leapt. The word was small, almost fragile, but it was the first spoken word Eli had ever said in her presence. She knelt beside him, taking his hands in hers. "Yes, Eli, I hear you. I'm right here." He smiled shyly and returned to his notebook, continuing to write and draw, but now with a new confidence that words were not frightening. Words could be tools, not chains. Samuel, watching from a distance as he tended the horses, felt his chest swell with emotion. His son had found a voice, however small, and it had come from love, patience, and understanding. The bond between the three of them had deepened in ways Samuel had never imagined. Clara had become the bridge between his son and the world, the steady hand that guided Eli without ever pushing him too far. Samuel had learned that vulnerability was not weakness, that asking for help and accepting love was not a failure. Together, they had created a family that thrived not in spite of challenges but because of them. The ranch itself reflected this harmony. The animals were healthier, the land more productive, and even the house seemed to glow with warmth and life. Samuel often walked through the fields with Clara at his side, feeling a peace he had never known. "I never thought life could feel like this," he said one evening as they watched the sunset, full and quiet at the same time. Clara smiled, squeezing his hand. "It's not the quiet that makes it empty, Samuel. It's the love that fills it." Eli continued to grow, both in confidence and in ability. He began helping with more complex tasks, from caring for younger animals to assisting Samuel with repairing fences. But more importantly, he began expressing himself in ways that were natural to him. Some days he would speak a few words, other days he would use gestures or drawings. Each form of communication was celebrated, reinforcing the bond between father, son, and teacher. Samuel marveled at how much his son had flourished under Clara's guidance, realizing that her presence had been as vital as the care and love he himself provided. The seasons changed once again, bringing autumn with its crisp air and golden leaves. One afternoon, Samuel and Clara decided to take Eli on a longer ride across the plains, away from the ranch. The boy, riding confidently between them, pointed out landmarks he had observed for months: the large rock where he liked to sit, the old oak tree by the creek, and the distant hills where the sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors. Samuel listened quietly, occasionally speaking to him, while Clara encouraged him to share his thoughts. Though words were sparse, the understanding between them was complete. That evening, as they returned home, Samuel realized something profound. He had once believed that life on the ranch would always be lonely, that his son's silence would create an unbridgeable gap, and that he himself would never experience love again. But the past months had proven him wrong. Love could grow quietly, patiently, and steadily. Family could be formed not just through words, but through trust, understanding, and shared experiences. Clara had also grown in ways she had never expected. The challenges of ranch life had tested her patience and resolve, but they had also shown her the strength of her own heart. She had learned to read Eli's silence, to support Samuel without judgment, and to find joy in the simple moments of life. She realized that teaching was not just about imparting knowledge, but about understanding, nurturing, and creating a safe space for growth. The small victories in Eli's life became a source of daily celebration. One afternoon, he carefully placed a drawing on the kitchen table. It depicted all three of them, Samuel, Clara, and Eli, standing together under the sun. Samuel looked at it, his throat tightening with emotion. He knelt beside his son, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "I see us," he whispered. "We are a family." Eli smiled shyly, drawing a small heart in the corner of the picture. Clara knelt beside him as well, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "Yes, Eli," she said softly. "We are a family and we always will be." Neighbors who had once whispered about the strange arrangement now admired the family from afar. They noticed the laughter, the quiet celebrations, and the strength of the bond that had grown. Samuel no longer felt judged or pressured. He had found his place, not just on the ranch, but in life. The community's acceptance was a welcome bonus, but it was the quiet love within the home that mattered most. One particularly cold winter evening, the family sat together by the fireplace. The wind howled outside, but inside, the warmth of the fire and the presence of one another created a sanctuary. Eli had fallen asleep with his head on Clara's lap, and Samuel held a steaming cup of tea in his hands, feeling the weight of gratitude and relief. Clara looked at Samuel, her eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. "We've come a long way," she said softly. Samuel nodded, his voice quiet but full of emotion. "More than I ever imagined. You've changed our lives, Clara, all of us." Clara shook her head gently. "It wasn't me alone. It was all of us, Eli, you and I together, we made this life. Love doesn't need words. It only needs patience and presence." Samuel took a deep breath, feeling the truth in her words. He looked down at Eli, peacefully asleep, and felt an overwhelming sense of completeness. For the first time in years, he did not feel lonely, and he did not feel burdened. He felt whole. As winter passed and spring approached once again, Samuel, Clara, and Eli continued to thrive. They faced challenges, of course, sudden storms, demanding work, and the ongoing effort of raising a child who experienced the world differently. But each challenge was met with patience, understanding, and love. Samuel no longer feared the unknown, for he had learned that the bonds they had built were stronger than any obstacle. One sunny afternoon, as they sat together on the porch watching the cattle graze, Eli quietly handed Samuel a small wooden box he had carved. Inside were tiny figures of the three of them, carefully detailed and lovingly crafted. Samuel felt tears prick his eyes. "This is amazing, Eli," he whispered. Eli nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. Clara leaned over, her hand resting gently on Samuel's arm. "He made it for all of us," she said softly, "a symbol of our family." Samuel looked at the figures, then at Clara and Eli. The silence that had once felt heavy was now filled with meaning. The love, trust, and understanding they shared spoke louder than any words could. Samuel realized that the journey they had taken together, the challenges, the patience, the slow building of trust, had created something rare and beautiful. He had not only found companionship and partnership, but had also helped Eli discover a way to communicate, to feel safe, and to thrive. By the end of this chapter of their lives, Samuel understood the true meaning of family. It was not just about living together under one roof. It was about understanding, patience, and love that transcended words. Eli, though still quiet at times, had found his voice in ways that were meaningful and profound. Clara had become the heart of their home, bridging gaps and nurturing growth. And Samuel, the once lonely cowboy, had found a life filled with connection, joy, and hope. As the sun set over the plains, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold, the three of them sat together on the porch. Eli drew in the dirt with a small stick, Clara smiled at him, and Samuel leaned back, feeling a deep sense of peace. Words were not needed to understand the love they shared. In the quiet of the ranch, they had found harmony, acceptance, and a family united not just by circumstance but by the heart. And in that moment, Samuel knew with certainty that life had given him more than he had ever hoped for. He had found love, partnership, and the joy of watching his son grow in a world that finally understood him. The once lonely cowboy was no longer alone. He had a family, a home, and a life that was full of hope, patience, and unspoken understanding.